Okay, so very simple one to start with. Have you always wanted to work in the IT industry?
Phil, I have a master's degree in international political economy from the London School of Economics because I was going to work for the World Trade Organization. I was going to support developing countries with economic policies that would benefit them. That was during the Great Recession. And for a variety of reasons, that is not what happened. I left London, I went back to the US, to Portland, Oregon, and I needed a job. And so I wound up in higher education. My journey to tech became a very intentional choice to get back to Europe. I've always wanted to live in Europe. You can tell from my accent, I'm American. If I'm lucky, maybe you think I'm Canadian, but I'm American. And I'd studied in France and Spain. I did my master's in London. I'd lived in France for a while. Like I always wanted to be back in Europe. And as the economy got better, I started to look around and say, okay, how do I get one step closer to living and working in Europe again? And the first step that I took was, okay, is there a way I can speak French in the US? Because I had that, I speak French and English. And the way I did that is my first job was inside sales, French, English. And that was my foot in the door into tech. And then I stayed in tech because there's always something to learn. You can do so many different things. You can really craft your own career. So I wound up moving into account management after a couple of years, going into Cloudability. A friend referred me into there. And then from there, I managed European customers, but from the US. Then after 2 years of that, I finally transferred over to London. So it was a series of very intentional steps because I wanted so badly to be in a certain location. And I found interesting work that was going to get me to that goal.
Okay, so having sort of got yourself into the IT industry, perhaps as you've explained, not for IT's sake initially, have you enjoyed that experience, or are you enjoying that experience to date as a slightly different career from the one you had imagined?
I love it. I really love it. I do miss the policy wonkiness that I really thought I was going to do, but also I'm interacting with different people solving interesting problems. And that gets me out of bed every day, right? Like software can do so many different things that address specific needs, not just for businesses, but for the public sector as well, for healthcare. And I get to be a part of that. And I get to actually impact people's careers and the work that they're doing and see them help create meaning out of their own projects. And I know there's a lot of day-to-day and a lot of admin in everybody's jobs, but the fact that I can walk away and say, actually, I really helped somebody, or I did something meaningful that has true significance for a company that's going to help them achieve their goals, that's a fantastic thing. I get to do that every single day. I'm helping my own colleagues, I'm helping customers, I'm working with partners, and that meaning is why I stay in tech.
Okay, and in actual sort of the job that you do at the moment, just a bit more detail as to the how, what, and where.
Yeah. My current title is Customer Portfolio Director of EMEA at Apptio. That is a really generic title. So that means I manage two different teams of account managers. One team's focused more on cloud solutions, the other team more on agile solutions. I work directly with our marketing team on thought leadership in the cloud sector because that is my background in software. And I'm also an authorized instructor for FinOps from the FinOps Foundation. So I'm teaching people best practices in that cloud financial management sphere.
Okay, and in terms, I mean, it sounds as if you had a plan and you fulfilled it, but along the way, have you bumped into any particular challenges work-wise? And bearing in mind the sort of title of our series, Women in IT, do you think any of those were gender related at all, or are they just sort of general challenges that anyone might encounter in their work life?
When I transitioned from education into tech, I convinced my kind of future tech employer that a lot of the enrollment work that I was doing, like admissions work, was very similar to the kind of cold calling that an inside salesperson does. And I remember that first month or so where my new boss was explaining to me how the internet worked. because I didn't know. Like I didn't know. Candidly, I still don't really like setting up my home internet, but I've learned a lot of other tech things along the way. And so I came in confident that I knew some things. I knew how to communicate with others. I knew how to facilitate meetings. I knew how to run trainings. I knew what motivated people, because that's what I had focused on. But I didn't know a thing about tech. And I was still in my 20s at the time, and I didn't have the same confidence that I have now, partly because you have enough times at bat, you have enough experience where you can say, you know what, I've achieved enough to know I'm bringing something of value to the table. But going into tech, I didn't have a sales performance behind me. I was coming into a tech sales role without that experience. And oftentimes, not always, but often, men are judged by their potential and women are judged by their performance. I didn't have any performance. I had nothing to show to say I will be good at this new role. And that, on top of this big knowledge gap, like I felt like an imposter for a long time. And I had loads of mentors and wonderful colleagues who really encouraged me, but I also encountered a fair number of people who treated me like eye candy. They treated me like a booth babe, like I was there to be pretty and to smile at customers, and did not invest in my potential, right? They weren't looking for my potential. So you got a 20-something young man coming in who doesn't know tech, but is a good communicator. You might say, hey, that person's got a lot of potential, I'm going to invest in them. That did happen sometimes to me. I think I was often underestimated because of my gender and my age and my lack of tech knowledge.
Okay, and in terms of the time that you've now been in the IT sector, have you seen attitudes change, and particularly again to the role of women in the workplace? And I'm wondering also, bear in mind what you've just said, do you think that change is generically good, or is it also because you are more experienced in that and therefore you've earned the respect, and perhaps younger people are still finding just some thoughts as to what might have changed over the time you've been in this space?
Yeah, so we can take that in a couple of directions. So I might answer that in two different ways, and we'll see how the conversation goes. I genuinely think that the advocacy and various diversity groups and not-for-profits around the world who are pushing this idea that diversity in tech is good for the individuals working in tech, and it's also good for business, frankly. Diverse teams tend to create more robust products that are better delivered, right? Think about some of the bias in AI, for example, that can be alleviated when a diverse team is helping to build the AI. So I do think we've seen a ton of progress. I was really lucky in that first tech role. I did have someone who mentored me and introduced me to Portland Women in Technology, which is a not-for-profit organization focused on keeping tech diverse. It is women in tech, but they've really expanded it to include a variety of underrepresented groups in tech. And I started volunteering with them and actually took on a leadership role with them. And so I was really surrounded by this positive influence, and I was able to pay it forward in a lot of ways. And I see that now at Apptio, right? The London office, we've got a group of women helping women. We've got Apptio's ERG, Employee Resource Group. London as a city, of course, has all of these groups. I think we've made a ton of progress. We're not done yet, but it is now sort of, you remember when Occupy Wall Street introduced this idea of the 99%? And it didn't necessarily change inequality, but it changed the way we talked about inequality. And I think that's what we're seeing now in tech, where we in tech, professionals in tech, do not fully represent the demographic of the cities or countries around us. But we've changed the way we talk about it. And it is now culturally accepted that we want a diverse group of people working in any business, and tech is behind the times compared to other businesses. And just having that be a recognized language, like Me Too, like the 99%, it allows us to move it forward because we've accepted a certain language and a certain foundation, and we can build from there.
And do you think, I mean, it sounds as if you do, but do you think there is more work to be done? It looks as if you're saying there's a good conversation being had, but maybe that needs to deliver some sort of tangible differences in the workplace. I'm just wondering, what do you think else might be done to improve that situation?
There's loads, and sometimes it can be challenging to talk about as a business leader. It might be challenging for someone to admit that they're looking for diverse candidates, but they're struggling to find them, or they are interviewing diverse candidates, but they're really leaning towards somebody. And is that because there's an implicit bias? Well, I don't know, it's implicit, right? So I think it's hard. People always want equity, diversity, inclusion to focus on these really positive stories of, look at this great intern program that we're launching, et cetera, et cetera. And those are genuinely really great. And also, because we want everything to look really good and be stars and rainbows on our diversity scale, we sometimes don't have the harder conversations where a company might celebrate that they're at 40% female, but in their executive, in their board level, and their C-level, are they only 25% female? And how do we continue to move diverse candidates up into leadership, which is going to provide an example to everybody else about what that company believes in, how they promote and support. And also, it's a great example if you've got a diverse person at the C-suite, the entire world can see, wow, somebody is in the C-suite who looks just like me, even if I'm not what you traditionally think of when you think of a CEO or CTO. So we don't always like to talk about some of those harder things. We want to celebrate the progress, but the reality is we have to sometimes be uncomfortable. We have to acknowledge that maybe we are not where we want to be on diversity in management or diversity in leadership. Maybe we're struggling in our intern program because we only looked at the schools we graduated from. And so we missed entirely historically Black colleges and universities because nobody in leadership attended those. So we didn't even think to look, right? Pardon the expression, we're the drunk looking for the keys under the streetlight because that's where the light is. Well, we need to get out of that comfort zone and start looking in those not streetlit places to try to bring in more diversity and new perspectives. That requires people to be uncomfortable, to admit that they don't know something, and that maybe they were not wrong, but sort of not fully conceived. And that it requires a lot of vulnerability that I think people struggle with.
And from your experience, whether at Apptio or more generally the folks you talk to, do you think at least the majority, if not all companies, are open to what you've just got, are aware of this and trying to address it? Or do you fear that there's a minority of companies, hopefully, but it's still too many, clearly, that sort of shut off that kind of, and yes, as you say, they pay a bit of lip service to it, and if there's 40% female employees, that's great, regardless of their status in the company, as opposed to, as you say, actually getting it to sort of work all the way up an organization.
Phil, that's a tough one. You get into some sensitive topics there, and also I'll disclose that I'm not in the minds of every C-suite person across the world, right? I don't know what's going on in those discussions. I'm not in the room where that happens. Let me pivot that slightly to say I'm aware that while I am a woman in tech, I am a white, well-educated, born and raised middle class woman in tech, and born in America speaking native English. And I don't think we should ignore the benefits of being a native English speaker when you work in business and tech. And so I think often we want to celebrate the great things, like, look at our women in tech. And I look and say, well, I mean, if you're doing a diversity checklist, I really only check one box, candidly. And that's great that we've brought a woman into tech. And while I'm not an engineer or a coder, I'm relatively technical, and I can speak to the business, and I can also speak to finance and to tech folks. That is not, that we're not done with diversity if all we've done is sort of hire 50% white, middle class, well-educated women. We're not done yet. And I don't want to put words into the mouths of other people or their intentions, but I do often worry that we have gone for the easiest forms of diversity rather than truly bringing in more diverse perspectives or people who might need more training, but demonstrate a lot of potential.
And in terms of folks who are, like you've described your journey to IT, I mean, people that are looking at the sector, whether it's younger girls maybe that are coming towards the end of their education and thinking it might be an idea, or people that are already in the workplace but like the idea, let's face it, IT is running the world, so it's quite a nice industry to be in. Have you got any advice as to what to look for in terms of the more progressive organization? I mean, is it as easy as looking on their website, and if they say the right things, yep, off you go, and that looks good? But any just sort of guidance as to how to begin a career in the industry?
Yeah, talk to different people in the industry. I consider myself very lucky. Some of the examples I had in Portland, where off the top of my head, easily 5 of the women I'm still very close with from that higher ed job that I was in, easily at least 5 of them are now doing something in tech, and maybe they're software engineers or software managers. Like one is a VP of customer operations, but it's for a tech company. And so to a certain extent, you have to look at the opportunities around you and take advantage of them. And that might require some additional training, but those stories of how somebody got to tech, it helps reveal that it's so much more than I studied computer science and then I went into some sort of engineering program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are so many different angles you can come into it, and you don't necessarily have to do something technical, right? You might find yourself drawn to marketing and communications, but then you wind up doing marketing communications in a tech company, right? And so tech doesn't rule the world, but it does touch everything. And talking to people about how they got there, get some examples, it helps you realize that there isn't just one archetype of who works in tech or what they do. And it'll help you see what's available for you based on what you're actually interested and what you'd like to do.
And you referenced earlier some focus groups, if you like, where women come together, whether it's, I think it's in Portland or industry-wide. So is that also a good sort of way in, or at least to tap into those as you go along, to give yourself support and at least confirm to you that what you're thinking might be the same as other people are thinking as you find your industry?
They're so good. They're so good. Now, I'm really lucky that the Portland Women in Tech has thousands of participants. It's well sponsored by local employers. Not every city is going to have something that big, although check it out. There might be a small meetup that is in your local area. And then if you are younger, there are lots of things like Girls Who Code, for example. If you're not younger in terms of like high school age, secondary school age, but you're still a young professional, like reach out to those groups. Also see if there are events locally you can attend. Like next month, we're doing Women of Silicon Roundabout. Apptio is a sponsor at the Women of Silicon Roundabout. And we'll have a speaker there talking about her experience in FinOps. And usually there are ways to get discounted tickets. I'm thinking now about the young professional who can't necessarily afford that type of conference. There's usually something there. You might have to do some extra research and digging, but you can find ways to get plugged into that network. And using that example, like the Women of Silicon Roundabout, you might think, oh, but I'm not in tech right now, so that's not the place for me. Like that's actually the perfect place for you, because you can say to people, I'm interested in tech and I don't know what to do next. And they can ask you questions and help you refine the way you think about it. So there are loads of those. Also, something COVID did that was good is more digital events. So now I'm thinking about the young professional who can't afford the trip, can't afford the ticket. There is still probably an imminently affordable digital conference where you can see other people's stories, see examples of companies you might want to work for, and then network that way instead.
Okay, and in terms of companies, I mean, you referenced, Apptio, you are the companies are clearly active in terms of the diversity sector, if that's the right description of it. But is it easy to identify companies that are more enlightened, shall we say, as to the role of women and I won't say other, but minority groups, etc. Or is that a bit of a sort of guessing game? You only sort of find out once you're on board a company.
Ooh, so just about every company will tell you in an interview or something like, oh, we're an equal opportunity employer and we celebrate diversity. Again, some of that you legally have to say, some of that is just the way the tide is turning at this point. You sort of have to whatever the equivalent of greenwashing is. I don't know, diversity washing, like you have to do that. But you can also do some searches on like companies that are most focused on diversity, companies with the most diverse like board of directors, for example. What I would say is, as you're doing your research, look for true examples of people who do not necessarily have that traditional background of I studied computer science and I went into tech. Ask during the interview, if you do go into that interview process, ask how they support diversity, what types of resources are there for continuing education, because that's a leading indicator that they're not just invested in hiring a diverse talent pool, but they're also looking for people with high potential, knowing that they're going to have to continue to develop them if they don't have a ton of experience coming in.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, and perhaps before we finish, it would be good, and it's perhaps a little unfair to limit you to one or two, but if there were a couple of things you think would be good to change in the industry or add to the industry, or are you able to one or two ideas, whether it's again more generally for the IT industry, any problems you think need addressing, or as I say, for the focus of our discussion, whether there's something they can do more around women in IT or diversity more generally.
This is a very broad statement. It's not a policy, even though I just told you I'm a policy wonk. If I could change one thing, I'd say less ego in the industry. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'm painfully aware that I don't know everything. I'm reminded of it every day. And that's actually something I love about cloud technology and working with customers is every day is a school day. There's always something you learn, because you can't possibly know every aspect of tech. You can't know every single company's business strategy. So when you interact with these other teams within your company or other customers, you learn. And if you go into life with that learner mentality and kind of turn down the ego a little bit, you recognize like, nobody knows everything, but we all know something. And that's going to make it a lot easier to work cross-functionally. It's going to make it a lot easier to hire diverse people and say, hey, maybe you don't know exactly how, this database is run, but you do seem to know a lot about these other things. And that means we can learn from each other. And when you take some of that ego out of there of I know everything, or this is the right way to do something, all of a sudden we're rowing in the same direction, saying, hey, I think we want the same thing here. We have the same goal. We might have difference of opinion on how to get there, but we can recognize that we're both trying to do something and we could start to work together. And I think that would eliminate a lot of the pain points and frustration that people feel when they're trying to be hired for a role or they're trying to acclimate to a new team. It's like taking that ego down a notch allows everyone to feel a little bit safer and therefore make progress.
And to that point, do you think, the industry talked, digital transformation is obviously the sort of buzz phrase that seems to be obsessing everyone, but collaboration is an important part of that, we're told. And I'm guessing that, to your point, if the storage folks have to talk to the network folks, who have to talk to the database people, who have to talk to the marketing people, who after all are actually selling something to some customers, does that help reduce that? Is that helping this conversation happen, or the sort of traditional cliched silos, do you finding that depressingly still exist in too many places?
So that is half of my day, honestly, is reaching out to different teams to say, okay, so here's, without too much detail, like I'm working with our accounting team and with our engineers to streamline a billing process. And like, everybody knows something, right? Again, everybody knows something. Nobody knows everything. But when we put our brains together and we say, here's the problem, here's what I think will solve it, is that technically feasible? Okay, what do you need? Okay, how do I prove that? How do we, quality assurance this? Like, so much of business success is bringing people together. And frankly, that's where diversity is great, because oftentimes when you're diversifying your workplace, you're bringing in new soft skills. So not just the computer science skills, but a stereotypical female qualification is the communication skills. And if you're able to bring all these different cross functions together and say, okay, we have a common goal, let's just do this. Like, that's what I spend so much of my time doing, but it's also the most rewarding part, because you're taking this like ball of spaghetti problem. It's not an easy problem, but when you bring everyone together and you actually start working and communicating, like all of a sudden you can make something really incredible happen.
And I promise this is the final one because I've kept you long enough, but just finally, do you think that, as with a lot of new ideas and technologies, they often require a champion in an organization, to get buy-in from people? Do you think women IT and diversity more generally requires someone at board level or at least senior management level to say, yes, this is important and we need to address it? Or is it possible for, shall we say, people more at the work face to sort of do something and then push it up an organization, or is that doomed to failure unless somebody champions the idea?
You've got to have both. And you've got to have both, right? If you're trying to change culture from the top down, like, culture is not a mandate. People don't, they're not inclusive because you told them to. They're inclusive because it's fun and they like the people they work with and they're learning and they're growing and there's opportunities to collaborate. So something top down still needs to be supported with the right resources. And similarly, sort of a bottom up culture, can very easily get squashed without the right kind of openness to new ideas from executives. And so wherever it starts, right, if you've got, a group of engineers who are really focused on a new project or a new way of working, or you've got an executive really focused, you still need to reach out across the aisle or across the pyramid, as it were, so that people can work together and actually achieve that big goal, whatever it is.
Okay, well, it's been brilliant to chat to you, and you've given us some really fascinating insights. So, Mallory, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. This was fun.